Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of our Towards Life 3.0 series. My name is Mathias Risse, and I'm the director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. And I am welcoming you also on behalf of Sushma Raman, our executive director, who will join us a bit later for this conversation. Our series Towards Life 3.0, Ethics and Technology in the 21st Century explores ethical and human rights related issues that arise in the course of the technological innovation that is happening all around us. Some of those challenges arise only as we consider the long-term prospects of humanity, but many of them are already very much upon us, given how much our private and professional lives are being shaped by technology, especially now digital technology. One part of life shaped in this way is people's sex lives, and it is in that domain that today's topic is located. Our topic for today is hacking, hustling, and sex worker advocacy online. And we are delighted to have with us Kendra Albert and Danielle Blunt. Before I introduce them, allow me to explain the background to this topic a bit. Many of you will have heard of Section 230 of the 1996 Communications Decency Act. In spite of its rather dry name, this piece of legislation has a rather serious impact on how internet platforms can operate, and thus has a big impact on our digital lives. Section 230 generally provides immunity from liability for providers and users of interactive computer services, as that's called then, who publish information provided by third-party users. It is based on this law, for example, that Facebook and Twitter are not liable for content the way publishers of print media are. So basically these platforms are not considered publishers in that traditional sense. Now that immunity does not prevail across the board. One exception is that enforcement of sex trafficking laws is not inhibited in any way by the immunity generated by Section 230. That this is so is captured by a legal package known as FOSTA-SESTA, where FOSTA is the Allow States and Victims to Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, and SESTA is the Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act. So they go by this package, FOSTA-SESTA, which both became law in 2018. Now, internet platforms have brought substantial benefits to sex workers. As opposed to negotiations on the street, an internet-based model allows sex workers to be more forthright in their advertising, negotiate costs and services prior to actually meeting clients, and establish boundaries for themselves. On the internet, sex workers are able to gain more control over their work environment and avoid some of the dangers of outdoor and street-based work, such as violence, sometimes to the point of homicide by clients, but also police violence, like being forced to have sex in exchange for not being arrested. Opponents of FOSTA-SESTA had worried that in an abundance of caution, websites enabling transactions around sex work would shut down. And that is precisely what happened. Craigslist abruptly shut its personal section just days after the approval of FOSTA-SESTA. Reddit also shut out sections of its website officially as part of a policy update. And another provider, Backpage, an advertising website that as of 2018 was set to be the largest marketplace for buying and selling sex altogether, was seized by federal law enforcement in April 2018. It was the investigations around that particular website, Backpage, that had given rise to FOSTA-SESTA in the first place. And this is where hacking hustling enters. Hacking hustling is a collective of sex workers and allies working at the intersection of technology and social justice. It is a space for digital rights advocates, journalists, and allied communities to learn from sex workers and better understand the emerging effects of FOSTA-SESTA on internet freedom. This organization was formed with the belief that sex workers are experts of their own experience and that an internet that is safer for sex workers is an internet that is safer for everybody. And now, without further ado, allow me to introduce today's speakers. They will have a conversation with each other for about 25, 30 minutes, and then we will have a discussion. So Sushma and I will join, and we will then also be delighted to bring in questions from the audience that you should be putting in the YouTube chat function that we will be screening. Kendra Albert is a clinical instructor at Harvard University's Cyber Law Clinic, where they teach students to practice technology law. They also serve as the director for the Initiative for Representative First Amendment, which provides funding and support to law students from backgrounds traditionally underrepresented in First Amendment law. Kendra also serves on the board of the ACLU of Massachusetts and as a legal advisor for Hacking Hustling. Kendra says of themselves that they enjoy giving away other people's money, playing video games, and making people in power uncomfortable. Danielle Blunt, who goes by Blunt, is one of the founding members of Hacking Hustling. She is an NYU-based dominatrix, a full-spectrum doula, and also a sex worker rights activist. She studies power dynamics and researches the intersection of public health, sex work, and equitable access to technology. She says of herself that she enjoys watching her community thrive, and as would behoove a dominatrix, but I still say this with some trepidation, also making men cry. So with all that said, without further ado, over to Kendra and Blunt. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Matthias. And yeah, you know, can you tell that we've written those bios to some extent to complement each other? So, you know, we really appreciate the Carr Center for welcoming us today to talk a little bit about Hacking Hustling's work. And, you know, one of the things that we've sort of been thinking about internally that Hacking Hustling has been thinking about is, after initially being formed to focus on sort of FOSTA, to try to prevent some of the passage of FOSTA along the lines of, after initially being formed as part of a collective that grew to try to keep FOSTA from being passed, Hacking Hustling's focus has been more recently on sort of broader work where sex workers can sort of actually be engaged in the creation of tech policy to prevent things like FOSTA-SESTA from happening again. And Matthias, I don't mean to critique you, but I do think there was one thing I want to frame that I think is really important to our story about what happened with FOSTA, which is, although the bill was framed in both the names and sort of the popular media as being about preventing sex trafficking, it in fact had a dual focus of both preventing sex trafficking, but also preventing consensual sex work. So it's really important to note that the effects on sex workers of FOSTA-SESTA weren't sort of a weird side effect or an unexpected outcome. Like, that was part of the goal of the bill. And that sort of brings us to some of the work that Hacking Hustling is doing now, which is more focused on sort of thinking about how having sex workers involved in questions around algorithmic governance, around AI, can change the sort of way that those systems unfold. And sort of with that, I'll let Blunt go.
Yeah, thank you so much for teeing me up there, Kendra. I appreciate it. And thank you for the introduction. So we're here today to talk a little bit about the work of Hacking Hustling, as well as sex worker inclusion in the study of algorithmic governance. And I think that the most salient way to analyze algorithmic governance impact on marginalized communities is through studying the impact on sex workers. For decades, sex workers have been at the forefront of exploring the potential of what technology can do. We have a rare understanding of the vulnerabilities and harms that technology produce. To draw on Foucault, one of the ways modern governance works is through the production of new marginal identities that can be better known and so better governed. Platform algorithms produce an imaginary sex worker category, which both is and is not actual sex workers. To identify sex workers, platform policies use proxies similar to how sex work is policed on the streets through racist, transphobic, and fatphobic policing tactics. And in that sense, it's a form of coding, which brings us closer to how Deleuze describes modern governance as reducing subjects down to various combinations of codes. My central question is, how do algorithms expansively code and therefore produce and police the sex worker as a category? And how does this affect both sex workers and non-sex workers who have been erroneously included in the sex worker category? Despite the considerable research on algorithmic violence, there are no studies to date of how these intersecting forces produce the sex worker as an imagined category of surveillance and censorship, nor of how sex workers strategically subvert and challenge these forces through their digital praxis.
So Blunt, how many times do you usually mention Foucault in your standard in community work for sex workers? Is that like, that's the standard line is like, okay,
Yeah,
we start with Foucault.
We start with Foucault, then talk about basic needs and desires and survival. Yeah, so that what I just read was from a grant proposal, and Kendra and I thought that it would be an interesting place to sort of speak while we're talking about how some of the work that Hacking Hustling does is to bridge the gaps between academia and the communities that are being studied. So this definitely isn't the language that is being used when I'm doing work in community. And it is definitely language that I have found that I have had to adapt to in order to be taken seriously by academia and attempt to get funding. So the framing is, I mean, I was interested in what I was saying. I don't know if anyone else was. It's arguably useful and interesting, but primarily when seeking academic resources, attention, and like seeking an institution to say that this is something that needs to be studied, this is something that needs to be included in the canon of research around algorithmic governance. But I can assure you that when a sex worker has been deplatformed or lost an account, lost access to a payment processor, that they aren't thinking about Foucault or Deleuze. And I think that the point of this really is the way that community-based and community-centered research approaches also have to kind of dress up the language that they're using in a way that is often inaccessible to the communities that they're serving. So much of academic research is not accessible to the humans that they're purporting to be speaking about. It's very much speaking over rather than being in conversation with. So part of what Kendra and I wanted to do is to have a conversation together. And for sex workers to be included in conversations on AI ethics, the Uberification of work, digital governance, we shouldn't really have to speak Foucault to be taken seriously or to be included in the conversation. And this is part of the work that Hacking Hustling does. We challenge categories of expertise and how expertise is constructed. And there's a huge disconnect between academia, tech, and the communities that are most impacted by what is being studied. And there is a need for more community engaged and community-centered work in this field.
Yeah, just to like build on that one, I think one of the really difficult things has been to talk about has been how I think people who work at academic institutions, and I include myself in this, often don't even have a sense of how inaccessible their work or their approaches are to folks who are from sort of outside them. I remember, one thing I think about is like the first time I like got asked to speak at an academic conference, and I'm like an academic in a lot of ways, but I was like, oh, well, wait, you're telling me I have to pay to go to the conference and then you're not going to pay me to speak? Like, and I think the question of who gets paid is actually something we talk about a lot because, there's this assumption in a lot of academic cultures, right, where that someone else is paying you for this educational work, whether it's your institution or like yourself if you're an adjunct, right? Like, a lot of this also breaks down around the adjunctification of higher education, but like this question of sort of like what are the implicit assumptions that academics have about, and like to some extent those are often sort of even orthogonal to tech policy people or technologists working in companies, and then orthogonal again to like sex worker community. But I also think that one thing that I've learned from working with Hacking Hustling that I think is important to recognize is often that academics working in institutions take for granted the agenda setting power that universities have, right? In terms of, I remember actually I saw on Twitter the other day, somebody like, oh my God, someone's teaching a class around like Beyonce's Black royalty stuff. And I at Harvard. I don't know, I didn't look it up to see if this was actually happening. So it could just be like Twitter misinformation, in which case, like, I'm not telling the story for the truth of the matter asserted, right? Like for the truth of the idea of teaching the class. But I was like, I think this represents both a misunderstanding of how like academic classes get pitched, right? Which is like somebody pitched this class. It isn't Harvard University was like, we will develop a class on Beyonce, but also that like that in itself is seen as important, right? The university and people within universities have this ability to agenda set. I think that to that extent, a lot of what concerns me right now about conversations about AI ethics or algorithmic governance or whatever we like the catchphrase we want to use for like governing computers, right? For computers, is this focus on fairness, accountability, and transparency as end goals, rather than sort of starting with, as Blunt flagged, like what communities need from these systems or what communities want, like are concerned about. And how disciplinary focus that like leads to not talking about people, right, is like getting replicated in these conversations around AI ethics, right? Like, you know, even like some of the AI ethics work that's like the most awesome and cutting edge, like the stochastic parrots paper from that that was presented at FACT and the subject of much controversy, right? It's a paper that's not necessarily a paper that's about the people who are harmed by these models directly. It's sort of about the nature of the models. And I both understand the need to study these models, but I also, you know, through my work with Hacking Hustling, have come to sort of wonder as to be like, can't we just reframe the entire set of questions around what people actually need from this, rather than sort of starting with the sort of things that we're the most comfortable with as academics, or people who work on like AI governance or AI ethics, which is like the systems and the machines. And yeah, so I like am curious, Blunt, in your experience, what kinds of barriers are there to sort of doing that more bottom-up work, especially from outside the formal academic structures?
Yeah, there are a lot of barriers, Kendra. And I think like earlier we were talking about how we met, which was on Twitter. I asked a question for a panel that you were moderating and you followed up with me. And before that, I don't know if there was a ton of research going on about FOSTA-SESTA or research at the academic institutional formal level. Hacking Hustling was doing some community-based research, some other sex worker organizing spaces were also doing surveys as well. But I think that's something that you touched on, Kendra, that academics can often overlook is the power of having an academic affiliation to community-based work is something that brings it into a space where it becomes something that is studied, that it becomes something that can be resourced, and it becomes something that can no longer be said, this is an unintended consequence, we weren't thinking about that. And regardless of the discipline, my experience largely in tech spaces is that sex work is always left out of the conversation. We saw about zero response to FOSTA-SESTA from tech, from academia, from many people who say that they work at like the intersection of tech and social justice. No one was making a comment on FOSTA-SESTA. And many people just dodged the question because they weren't able or willing to do that work. And conversations and studies around AI and algorithmic governance, despite sex workers being at the cutting edge of research of care work, emotional labor, working in online spaces, and counter surveillance practices and harm reduction, sex workers are always left out of the conversation, even when it's like a glaring hole. And so I've taken to asking people, what about sex work? Which is sort of how Kendra and I started talking. I was like, what about this? Why is no one talking about FOSTA-SESTA if this author is giving a presentation on CDA 230, why aren't you prepared to talk about this amendment that was just proposed? And I've been told, I just have a list here. I've been told that we almost hired a former sex worker from a very large research organization in New York. I've been told that we didn't have space to include sex work in this research on something like gigification of emotional labor because of our word count. And maybe we'll do that in a follow-up piece.
Can I sort of a friendly amendment to your point about like the way in which like academia not engaging with sex work and FOSTA. Like, I think what was also striking about it is like, there were definitely academics who are sort of really concerned about FOSTA, and like, Eric Goldman pops to mind as someone who was like, I think like very much on like concerned about it, but his angle was very, I think, focused on Section 230. And like, that's not to knock Eric, because like, I think that's what he does. Like, he basically like writes on Section 230. But I think that care about sex workers didn't extend beyond Section 230, right? It was like, this is relevant. I'm interested in and concerned about sex workers because it's relevant to this direct thing that I'm working on. But like, I'm not actually going to go out of my way to center sex worker needs in my research agenda, right? And I think that that's something that we've seen a fair amount, especially in the 230 landscape, where FOSTA, like, it isn't even a question of like, are we talking about FOSTA? Like, because like, you don't need to center sex workers to talk about FOSTA, right? In the context of 230, you should just be talking about FOSTA in the context of 230, because it's the only amendment to Section 230 that's been passed since Section 230 was introduced like 20 odd years ago. And so like, you better learn from it, whether you like care about sex workers or not. But the other question is like, how the other thing that seems to be going on there is this way in which like, as blunt as I think your comments point out, folks seeing as this as sex work as orthogonal to the real work that they're doing, rather than sort of saying, hey, if we start from the perspective of centering like sex worker needs, what do we learn from that? And how would that change the work that we're doing? And I think that's like really such an important like reframe, especially as we move towards these like algorithmic questions, because I think that like, the ways in which like, in order to see the ways in which like whorephobia is part of these algorithms or technologies, you have to understand how whorephobia, like sort of fear of or hatred of sex workers, right, has been operating before algorithmic systems, and that requires sort of engagement with this history. It's not going to like just sort of randomly pop up from sort of like, you're not going to be able to have an accurate picture of how this fits into a broader history if you haven't already been engaging with these issues. Anyway, sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I think it's a really good point that whorephobia, racism, transphobia, fat phobia are already embedded into algorithms and technology and society. It's a reproduction of existing biases, and ignoring them in the work of community organizing around these issues is inherently flawed framing of AI studies. It's a flawed framing of understanding FOSTA and future amendments to Section 230. Because the people who are working on Section 230 reform aren't working on any of the issues that the bills seeking to amend Section 230 are ostensibly seeking to address, like trafficking and stopping child sexual exploitative material, or countering extremism. The most people who are working on Section 230 amendment are not in community, or are not in contact with the communities who have been deeply impacted by the harm of FOSTA. And right, the only way to study an algorithm is by studying the inputs and the outputs. And what we know, or what I know as a sex worker, what we know as a community of sex workers, is the impact of these algorithms and how they impact our life. And I see so much of this community knowledge and expertise being ignored, or something from sex worker Twitter being presented as a new academic finding without citing sources and citing community, and it needing to be framed in like academies, for lack of a better term, in order for it to like move through certain spaces and be like seen as and identified as knowledge, as like a subject to be studied or something to be put on a curriculum. And I think so much is lost when we remove and ignore and erase communities from these conversations.
Yeah, I think one of the ways I'm currently seeing that play in the like conversations about like AI ethics that I've been part of is like sort of this idea that like improving algorithms is seen as kind of this net good. This has like come up in some work I've done with a group of colleagues where I work on adversarial machine learning techniques. So this is like attacks on machine learning systems. And one of I don't want to spoil any of our forthcoming research, but I will say we're looking at broader impact statements, which were these things introduced by NeurIPS, a prominent ML conference, to talk where people talk about the social aspects of their work, like what's going to happen because of it. And what's really striking to me is the way the sort of underlying politics of these statements, which is like obviously creating faster, smarter, more secure algorithms is always better. But like the politics, like a lot of what we're seeing out of communities that are the subject of many of these algorithms is actually a politics of refusal, right? They don't want them to work better. They don't want like, more Black folks included in the facial recognition database. They would like facial recognition banned, right? And so I think that and like you can see that these same conversations taking place in work around sex work, where there seems to be this idea that we just need to like more accurately do content moderation or flag who's a sex worker and who's not. And I think, apropos of Blunt's initial statement about sort of the ways in which like sex worker is a constructed identity using a series of proxies rather than an actual status, in addition to being an identity that people identify with, the like improving fraud detection algorithms such that they can more accurately identify folks who are trading sex just leads to more folks who look like sex workers getting kicked off platforms. So it's not necessarily making things better if the end goal of the algorithms is not actually like well aligned with good, right? And it just reminds me of the conversations around improving or reforming policing, and the ways in which those often end up just with more funding, more support for police, rather than sort of engaging in the question of like what is the alternative to these policing systems?
Yeah. And the same people who are harmed by policing are the same people who will be harmed by algorithmic policing and content moderation. You've seen this time and time again. And so I think it begs the question, like, what does good mean? Like when they're talking about like, oh, we'll make better AI or we'll make good AI, but like good for who? For people working in formal economies? Are we conflating good and legal? Are we trying to erase sex from the internet? Are we conflating pornography with something similar to like videos of people being murdered online? I'm thinking of the certain dust jacket of a book on content moderation where they talk about the two things hand in hand as if they are something that needs to be dealt with similarly or causing similar trauma. And I think it's not an issue, for me, it's not an issue of people's sex lives. It's an issue of people's ability to support themselves and survive that is being hindered by these algorithms. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about fraud detection algorithms, Kendra.
Sure. So I think this is valuable because I think sometimes this can seem kind of non-concrete. So like maybe we can sort of like close with this kind of very specific example. So, many payment platforms, well, in fact, all payment platforms in the US are required to sort of engage in detection of certain kinds of transactions and often also to engage in detection of fraud, right? And, generally speaking, what that means is they often prohibit folks from selling like sexually explicit materials through things like Shopify or whatever, right? Any of the more standard payment processors, because in theory, the chargeback rate on sexually explicit materials is higher. What that means is just that people like return them, right? Or say like, oh, I didn't order this. And like that may or may not be true. I don't like actually know. And also like, it's like, well, if like cultural shame regarding sexual material is what's causing these chargeback rates, like why are we complicating it by pushing people off onto other payment providers? But what this means in practice is that many of the payment systems that people, non-sex workers, civilians take for granted, right? Things like Venmo or PayPal are not accessible to folks who are sex workers, or to Blunt's earlier point, might look like sex workers, right? So, I have a friend who is a sex worker, and as well as a former sex worker, who can't donate on GoFundMe because they've been sort of basically blocked from the platform because of suspicious activity, basically meaning you look like a sex worker. So I think that those kinds of fraud detection algorithms, which I see presented in the machine learning literature as totally neutral, obviously positive things, right? I think it's really valuable to think about those as one of the examples of the sort of a use of AI or algorithmic systems, right? We can dither about whether AI is even the right term, right? Machine learning, for these purposes that are considered socially positive, while really having systemic harm on communities that are sort of, as Blunt said, just trying to make a living. And I think that's a sort of centering sex workers and use cases around thinking about things like fraud detection, I think can help us really just be in a more rigorous conversation and engaging in a more complicated narrative around how sort of we as academics or as tech policy people engage with these questions of how is AI or machine learning being used, and then what is the narrative that we're telling ourselves about what's good or what's legal, and how is this sort of working more broadly in online spaces. So I think, Blunt, I don't know, do you want to?
I just wanted to add a personal narrative there as well. I last week lost my payment processor to a risk or fraud detection for a not sex work related venture providing tech consultancy, and they shut it down. So I can no longer accept payment to not do sex work either. So it both, and I guess my interest in this research is how the fuck do they know? I have many different devices. I am using a VPN. I'm using different email addresses. So I think part of my interest in this research is we really don't know exactly how this information is being sent between different platforms, and how the information provided on an ad website and the facial recognition technology is leading to the deplatforming from other platforms as well. And I think what's really upsetting and also interesting about me losing access to a civilian website that isn't used for sex work is that I'm being told that because I am a sex worker, because I am a whore, I am not allowed to make money at all, even if it's in a different sector. And this is not an uncommon thing to happen. And it also, what Kendra was talking about not being able to donate to GoFundMe's, when Hacking Hustling organizes events, it's great when academia can pay, although it's very hard to get money from academia for some reason. But what's even harder is moving the money to community, because no one has access to any of the same financial technologies. And it's this, I think we sent around the meme of the guy pointing at the conspiracy theory chart, and just being how are we going to get this money to different people and move it in a way that's possible. So it disrupts people's ability to make an income, to build community, as well as to organize. And I think that's a really important component of this conversation, the way that machine learning renders populations invisible and unable to engage with a platform in a way where it becomes commonplace for people to speak over those communities because they've been invisibilized by the platform.
I think we'll stop there. I'm sure I imagine folks have a lot of questions because we covered a lot of ground. So yeah, very, very happy to talk about any of that more.
So thank you both, Kendra and Blunt, for this fascinating conversation. I've learned so much and I've taken lots of notes. And I think the theme around not just thinking in terms of governance, but really thinking about justice, right? And the ways in which people are reduced, subjects are reduced to code, the exclusion of communities, and how to better center community needs, in both academic but also policy discourses are very well received, I think. We have a few questions from the audience, and then I'm sure, you know, both Mathias and I have some questions as well, but I'll start with two that are more basic in nature, just to kind of take a step back for those who may not be familiar. So one question said, can you explain FOSTA and SESTA to those who don't know the acronyms? And the other person said, is the reluctance to include sex workers in the conversation tied to the way that FOSTA-SESTA was pitched as an anti-trafficking piece of legislation? So perhaps if we could address those two questions briefly, then we could dive into some of the more, nuanced conversations about this topic and the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad folks asked, because I think, you know, for those of us who like live and breathe FOSTA-SESTA or Section 230, I never know like what level of detail we're talking at. So maybe I'll do a first pass at answering, and then Blunt, if you have things to add, you can chime in. So I think, as Mathias said, FOSTA and SESTA were bills that were, it was a law that was passed in 2018 to amend Section 230 of the the Telecommunications Act, which prevents websites from being held liable for speech that they host. What FOSTA-SESTA actually does is changes the legal risk analysis for online platforms that are hosting speech around sex work or sex trafficking. To be fair, you know, the work actually that I've done with Hacking Hustling, our legal analysis suggests that it actually, for the most part, changes that risk relatively little. There's one federal law, Section 1595, the federal criminal anti-human trafficking statute, that platforms can be now held liable under, as well as a new criminal charge, Section 242(1)A. You asked for an explanation, you're getting a bunch of numbers. But in any case, the answer is that it doesn't change the analysis a ton. However, platforms perceived their risk as having increased quite substantially, and as such, took the steps that Mathias flagged earlier of shutting down lots of places that were previously hosting both kind of sexually explicit material more generally, but particularly ads that were often used by sex workers. Backpage is actually not, which was part of the motivation of the passage of the bill, was not shut down under FOSTA-SESTA. They shut it down on unrelated criminal charges. But things like Craigslist's personal section, if you remember Misconnections, well, Misconnections doesn't exist anymore. It's because of FOSTA. Also, FOSTA killed a lot of people. Yeah. But the other question was, I'm sorry, I totally forgot. I got so carried away.
I got it. I think
okay,
maybe we'll see. Well, I think that's a good point about Backpage FOSTA-SESTA not needing to be signed into law in order for Backpage to be seized by the FBI and shut down. Because FOSTA-SESTA is operating in this ecosystem of whorephobia and the criminalization of sex work. Sex workers have been losing access to online spaces for as long as companies have been getting like venture capital funding, and they've been then kicked off after like building the client base for these platforms. So it's not something that's new. We've lost site after site again, are in this state of like constant migration to figuring out what the next platform is that we can use to stay safe. And I think that's a great example that Backpage is often misattributed to being taken down because of FOSTA-SESTA, and even the people who wrote FOSTA-SESTA, I think, were like, look what Backpage is down, look what FOSTA-SESTA did. So there's a lot of misinformation around that. And then I think the second question was about, are people or academics afraid to talk about FOSTA-SESTA because of the language of stopping sex trafficking and fighting sex trafficking? And I think that is a big part of it. I think that the language in these bills that we're seeing to amend Section 230 are all using language that invoke a moral panic. And I think that is exacerbated by lack of engagement with communities who are impacted. And I think a lot of it was, and I think like, Kendra, when I reached out to you to ask the question, your response was like, oh, I've been wanting to talk about this, but I don't want to speak over sex workers. Let's chat. And I think that's a really great example of a response of like being open to community engagement without speaking over communities who are already doing that work.
I think the other thing I'll add to what Blunt said is we talk about, and like, I think this is for good reason, sex work and sex trafficking as if these are like two entirely separate things with involving different populations. And part of that is because oftentimes, historically, sex workers have sort of been accused of like, you know, carrying water for folks engaged in sex trafficking or sort of, but the reality is that survivors of sex trafficking and people who engage in sex work and all forms of sex trades, those are overlapping categories, right? Just as like survivors of child sexual abuse and sex workers are overlapping categories, just as sex workers and academics are overlapping categories, right? So, you know, Lorelei Lee, our colleague, has this incredible piece called Cash Consent, where she talks at length about like her experience and sort of thinking about it in terms of the trafficking framing. But I think it's really hard because we both, I think we all want to be careful. It's important to both be careful in our language and acknowledge that sex work and sex trafficking were both targeted by FOSTA, but also that like oftentimes, you know, the line between what folks might consider sex work and what folks might consider sex trafficking is a little more complicated than law can kind of see.
And it's true for labor trafficking in any industry. And I think that's an important thing to remember as well, that we live in a capitalist society where labor exploitation happens in every industry, not just the sex industry. And there's a lot of moral panic around focusing on labor trafficking conversations in the sex industry. And I had another point, I swear. Well, I think also what Kendra was saying is that the things that happened in response to FOSTA from these platforms harmed sex workers, survivors of trafficking, and people who hold both of those identities the same. It did nothing to make trafficking survivors safer or to reduce trafficking. And if anything, it actually increased the circumstances in which labor exploitation happens, which is it reduced people's access to income, it reduced people's access to community, it invisibilized communities, it pushed labor further underground, and it gave workers less bargaining power with the people who were paying them. And those are all things that make an individual more vulnerable to trafficking. So these aren't two discrete communities that we're talking about. And it's usually things that protect sex workers are also going to add some protection to survivors as well, and those who hold both identities, because what folks need is access to resources, not laws governing them and criminalization. They need access to resources, mental health care, food, housing, the ability to traverse borders. So like that's what folks need. And I think that's what so much of this legislation and research in academia is really missing when talking about this.
Maybe just as a follow-up to that last point, Blunt, that you made, can you maybe just elaborate that a little bit? What was the immediate impact of the community of sex workers of this legislation? So how has the day-to-day, week-to-week, the way people think about their profession, how has that changed?
Sure. Well, I think it's important to note that sex workers expertly predicted what would happen if FOSTA and SESTA was signed into law, and it happened immediately. I think a lot of what Craigslist response was on their personal side, their escort ads had been taken down a few years before, but Craigslist response was any platform that can be used can be misused or something like that. And I think that is a really like concise summary of what FOSTA did on the platform end, which was incentivize mass censorship and erasure of people on the margins who might be deemed high risk. We lost tons of harm reduction resources. People didn't know if it would be further criminalized to host that type of information, such as bad date lists, where people report incidents of violence and it's circulated on like a back end within community to keep each other safe. A lot of ad sites went down, specifically the free and the niche sites, which means that folks who already didn't have the money to place an ad were the ones who were impacted the most. There have been lots of reports of increased amount of people who are working on the streets. And one thing that the internet did was place, for folks who had access to the internet, was to place distance between themselves and a client so that they could negotiate the terms of their labor more easily and safely. And so a lot of these websites don't exist. And I think shadow banning and deplatforming is a problem that's increased. I don't know if it's necessarily due to FOSTA or SESTA. It's something that kind of has always happened. And I know this is something I talk about a lot too, is after FOSTA-SESTA, a lot of sex workers were finding horophobic clauses in terms of service, but that had been there for years because this is how sex workers have always been treated online. But there were lots of loss of these resources. There were reports of pimps contacting sex workers who they used to work with or for, and clients reaching out to sort of like take advantage of the precarity of the situation of sex workers, like towards the end of the month, as they knew rent was due. And there was an increase of violence as well. And we have, if you go to hackinghustling.org and check out our erased research, we have a ton of stats and more research on the impact. So I just dropped that in the chat as well.
Thank you so much. So, you know, as you both were talking about both the challenges facing sex workers as well as some of the issues that you've seen confronting other communities and grassroots organizations and movements. And I was thinking also on my own work, thinking about, you know, some of the efforts by, for example, humanitarian groups dealing with the challenges of tracking from, you know, asylum seekers and refugees, or trans rights activists, you know, tackling the issues of surveillance technology. So are there opportunities for cross-movement solidarity and collaboration, and how are those manifesting?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer, like the short answer, is absolutely yes, right? I think that, I think one thing I always want to emphasize is I think that, you know, sometimes, how do I put this in a way that's both succinct and also contextually accurate, right? Like sex rights, sex workers' rights is a trans rights issue, for example, or it's also an issue of sort of migrant labor, right? Like I think one of the things we saw with the Atlanta shooting and sort of the focus after that is the way in which oftentimes, you know, horophobia is most deadly to those who are at the margins in sort of on a number of different axes. So, you know, trans sex workers, Black and brown trans sex workers being targeted, Black and brown trans folks being viewed as sex workers more generally, you know, Asian sex workers who are doing work in massage parlors have been a particular focus of anti-trafficking orgs that often, I think, don't necessarily engage thoroughly with like those community-based needs. And that's something Red Canary Song has done a lot of work on. So I think my own personal view is like, there's so much place for solidarity. As a like sort of my own activist philosophy, or my own philosophy, is that it's better to start at the issues that are central to the lives of the folks who are most marginalized, and it'll like kind of trickle up, right? Which is to say that, like, you know, if we center, you know, like folks who are engaged in, you know, certain forms of street sex work and thinking about what they need, which, you know, generally the consensus seems to be is decriminalization, right? A full decriminalization of sex work. You know, that is a more helpful movement goal than necessarily the repeal of FOSTA, although the repeal of FOSTA would also be good, because helping folks who are the most marginalized is how we build solidarity across many, many different movements, and also how we engage like sort of most productively in making sure that we're not making a mistake that the LGBT rights movement has made repeatedly, which is, I think, well, this is my view, but prioritizing folks who are priorities like marriage, where there are people who benefit, but it often reifies sort of existing power structures rather than helping those at the most margins. But I'd be very curious as to Blunt's thoughts.
Yeah, I think like starting there and going just a little bit further, I think it's not just decriminalization of sex work that sex workers want, it's decarceration of incarcerated sex workers. I want to see folks have opportunities to work or to not have to work and to take care of themselves and their communities, and to have access to these tools to survive that the state takes away from people, or it's not there for certain people. And I think there's been lots of research on this. I think Hacking Hustling has a statistic of it. I think it's between like 60 and 80% of sex workers often report facing other barriers to other forms of work, such as having a disability, or being the primary caretaker of children and being able to earn a large amount of money in a short period of time and not being able to engage in other types of labor. So I really think what Kendra was saying is a really important part of like asking communities what they want and need and working to meet those needs as directly as possible.
Thank you. So I have a couple of related questions trying to assess the, what there's to learn from all of this as of 2021. So first question, so let's just roughly distinguish between exploitative and non-exploitative sex work. So what I hear you say is that as far as the non-exploitative work is concerned, basically that's where the impact is, and it's entirely negative because all these possibilities for being safer by being online, they have been undermined. Whereas as far as the exploitative sex work is concerned, your point earlier was that basically nothing there has changed at all, because basically there has been sex trafficking, human trafficking been going on, and the internet was one way in which one outlet, right, one place where that was marketed, but now it's just being marketed elsewhere. So this hasn't really helped. So that's a pretty devastating picture, right? So you're basically saying the impact has only been on the non-exploitative side and only been negative there. That's my first one. Is that a correct assessment? Is that where the thinking is? The second one, just quickly, the second one is kind of a more general version of that. Since Kendra, you mentioned this kind of in passing, this is the only amendment so far, the only addition to Section 230. So we have to kind of try to learn something for that, also for this larger context of what to do with 230. What are we learning here? So these are two neighboring questions. Over to you guys.
Yeah, I can start with the first one. I think that the categories and the binary of exploitation and non-exploitation isn't a particularly helpful framework here, because I think that it sort of ignores that all labor has the potential to be exploited under capitalism, and people are making decisions based on choice, circumstance, or coercion in all of these circumstances. So, right, like if no, I won't say that. Yeah, go ahead, Kendra.
Yeah, I think one way that has been helpful for me to understand it is in Revolting Prostitutes. Molly Smith and Juno Mack have this really incredible chapter on sort of sex trafficking as a production of like borders, basically, of immigration status, and the ways in which migration and sort of particular rules around who can and can't come into countries is always going to be related to the circumstances under which people find themselves in relationships or in like circumstances we would consider sex trafficking. So for example, someone's passport being held, and this is assuming they have like a patent passport, but like, you know, if you're working in a place where your boss says, hey, if you piss me off, I'm going to report you to immigration authorities, right? You know, there's a bunch of different ways you could understand that situation as to be exploitive, but one of them is also having to do with the overall structural sort of circumstance under which people are sort of laboring. And I think that goes to Blunt's sort of focusing on the divide between exploitive and non-exploitive labor as sort of a false binary. I think the other thing I would say about Mathias, to your point about sort of like, okay, so like, what does this mean? What did FOSTA mean for the circumstances under which people are engaged in sex work? Is I think that as the cash consent piece, I think really illustrates really well. Folks are, and Blunt just said, right, folks are trying to make the best choice for them in the moment. And one of the things that FOSTA-SESTA did was eliminate a whole host of choices that were previously available. So I think that when we talk about what FOSTA has done in terms of sex trafficking, part of it is that there are now probably more folks who are in circumstances where they control less about their own sort of means of accessing work or the circumstances under which they work. And like, do I want to say, oh, that means there's more sex trafficking? Well, it's like a complicated question because I actually don't want to assign that word to people's experiences. I don't like, that's something I would feel very strange about. But like, I think the point there is that the circumstances under which people find themselves working have been materially changed by the law because there are now fewer safe options. And that's true of folks engaged in sex work across or in the sex trades across a variety of different spaces. Blunt, does that seem like a fair characterization?
Yeah, and I think this might also answer some of the question as well, is that in Hacking Hustling's research, we also did find that folks who were based in street-based economies really didn't know what FOSTA-SESTA was, and really the primary difference of what they noticed after April 2018 was just reporting more workers on the street as well. But for folks who didn't have access to online spaces to begin with, this law didn't really impact them the same way as for folks who did have impact to the harm reduction working tool of having access to technology and increased choices of choosing their labor.
So to respond to the sort of last question, which is like, what can we learn from FOSTA-SESTA? I have sort of two different responses. One is, I think that, you know, what Blunt said earlier is really true, which is often folks are thinking of 230 amendments as a way to kind of deal with a big picture policy problem of which they have not attempted to use most of the other levers that we know might work better, right? You know, it turns out that frankly, probably, you know, increased welfare payments would probably have done more to reduce folks engaged in the sex trades rather than, you know, FOSTA. But I think the other thing we can sort of learn from it, and this is sort of what my research had, along with a bunch of other really fantastic folks, Lorelei Lee and Elizabeth Brundage at Cornell, basically found is that the actual change to the law is small enough that, in my personal opinion, it cannot justify the actions that most online websites took in response to FOSTA. And I'm not talking about Craigslist, like folks who are posting ads are sort of in a different category, but most of the widespread crackdown on sexual material on online platforms or things like Facebook's prohibiting like the use of emojis in the context of asking questions about sex, right? Like none of this can be justified by FOSTA. You know, it has to, the only way for me to understand this is in the context of existing sort of whorephobia within the US or within online platforms. And why that makes me really nervous about potential later 230 amendments is because I think that topical 230 amendments can be justifications that platforms use to make changes that they may have slightly like sort of wanted to make anyway, or that the lack of 230 immunity just like sort of allows for cover for changes to online platforms that harm folks on those platforms who already don't have a lot of power. And that makes me really concerned about the potential ramifications of 230 changes for activists more generally, who are on platforms who are not seen as the primary users that platforms are excited to retain. So that's that's my not so rosy outlook from having done all this FOSTA work.
And I think just like to wrap it all up, really like centering the experiences of people in AI research or any future amendments to Section 230, not platforms, is going to be really important to continuing this work in a way that centers community knowledge and expertise.
Thank you both, Kendra and Blunt, for joining us today. I think we could have continued the conversation for much, much longer. And I thank you both for your leadership and your scholarship, and look forward to continuing the conversation. For those of you who are joining us online, we will meet again in April to talk with Sheila Jasanoff, who's really a pioneer in the field of science and technology studies, and look forward to continuing the conversation. So thank you.